Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to speak about T.S. Eliot, the poet. As we know, T.S. Eliot was one of the most outstanding figures of the 20th century, perhaps one of the most influential poets of his time. He influenced many writers after him, and he himself was influenced by Charles Baudelaire, one of the French poètes maudits. And his symbolism and also many other features of Baudelaire's poems. He quoted Baudelaire very often in his poems too. But we will have a look at quotations later. For now, let's speak about T.S. Eliot, the poet. T.S. Eliot was a cosmopolitan poet. We have already said that he had a cosmopolitan mind, that he was extremely open-minded. He had broad views. He wanted to consider himself a citizen of the world, not an American or a British citizen. He was the son of a British mom and a British dad, but at the same time he was brought up in America. He traveled a lot, so he could see things from many different perspectives. He considered the poet as a medium who had the task, the objective, the purpose of describing reality in an extremely objective, impartial and impersonal way. So the poet did not have to express his own feelings or her own feelings, emotions, thoughts, views, but allow the reader to imply, to understand, to make hypotheses and to speculate, to try to make hypotheses on the meaning of the poem itself. There is also another aspect of T.S. Eliot's poetry which is particularly interesting, and it is the communicative feature of his poems. Eliot wanted to communicate through his poems, but also through the musicality and the rhythm which he wanted to convey in his poetry. So he tried to put together a combination of words and of sounds that would allow a non-native speaker or even somebody who did not understand the English language to perceive, to feel something while they were listening to his poems. For instance, a German person who did not speak English would have had to, or would have to today, feel something while he or she is listening to one of T.S. Eliot's poems, even just the rhythm and the musicality of the poem itself. So T.S. Eliot was extremely original. He was a genius. He was an extremely creative mind, and he introduced many techniques which I am sure you cannot see on our board. They are written here, and they are the technique of implication, which we have already mentioned. Technique of implication means that the reader had an active role while reading the poem or listening to the poem. Implication comes from the word to imply. To imply means to speculate, to hypothesize, to make assumptions, to try to understand for ourselves. So implication, a technique of implication, means that the reader cannot just expect somebody to explain something to them. T.S. Eliot would never have directly expressed his opinion. He wanted the reader to create his or her own opinion. And this is the technique of implication, which is strictly connected to the concept of the objective correlative. If I say objective correlative to you, I'm sure you'll think about an extremely famous, popular and special Italian writer. I don't know if you've already guessed, because this writer also used this technique. If I tell you the title of one of his works, maybe Ossi di Seppia by Eugenio Montale. Ossi di Seppia in itself is an objective correlative. What is an objective correlative? If we want to use the definition that we will find in books, it is the attempt to communicate philosophical reflections and feelings through a simile, or through a description, or a dialogue, or even a monologue. But in actual fact, what does this definition mean? It means that the author will not express a concept directly, but the author will use a number of a description or a dialogue or a monologue which symbolizes a concept or a theme or the depth of his thought and of his feelings. Aussi disapia in itself is an objective correlative, because even just imagining what it looks like, it is bare, it has no meat on it. We are talking about a fish bone which has no meat on it, and it is naked. So it may represent the lack of substance, or the lack of flesh, or the lack of something, or even the core of something. If we look at a fishbone, the fishbone can actually also be seen as the core of the fish itself. So it is up to the reader to imply and to understand what Montale intended when he wrote his poems. So Eliot also uses the objective correlative, and Eliot also uses another extremely important technique, which is called the technique of juxtaposition. To juxtapose means to overlap, to put something on top of something else. So, for example, to put this on top of this so that they overlap. Overlapping, juxtaposing means that they are there is a combination of something in his poetry. So what does Eliot juxtapose in his poems? He juxtaposes reality versus myth. If you look down here, you will see that he used the mythical method, which means that he described his own reality, but he also described some myths, as you will see when we have time to read his poems. So he switches from reality to myth. He switches in time and space. So one moment we are in the present, and one moment we go back to the past. In one moment we are in real life, and then all of a sudden some mythological figure appears. He used unquoted and often described in his poetry, for example, Arthur, the Round Table, the Holy Grail, etc. What else does he juxtapose? He juxtaposes squalid and poetic elements. The squalid elements might be the elements which are typical of modern life, or even everyday life elements, like an open tin of food. It seems futile, it seems unimportant, and Eliot juxtaposes some deep concepts in his poems together with the tinned food. He also juxtaposes, and this could be an example of what we have just said too, the trivial and the sublime. So this is another one of his techniques, of the techniques used by this author. He also uses repetition very often in his poem. And what else? Something I did not write on the board, but which is extremely important: quotations. Eliot was constantly quoting other writers, like, for example, Dante, Shakespeare, Baudelaire, all the poets that he admired or that he considered important to quote. Why did he do this? We have to consider that among the themes, among the most important themes in T.S. Eliot's works, we have the contrast between fertility and sterility. Fertility is associated by Eliot with the past, while sterility is associated to the present. So the fact that Eliot constantly quotes other writers may be related to the fact that he looks at the past, he looks up at the past as something beautiful, something which was characterized by grandeur, and the present, on the other hand, is described as something squalid, as a society which is characterized by alienation. Alienation is another concept which is typical in Eliot's poems. He focuses on the alienation of modern society, of people in modern society. If you have the chance to read the Fire Sermon, a part of the poem of this section of The Waste Land, you will see how Eliot uses the description of a sexual encounter between a clerk and a typist as an objective correlative for the alienation of in modern society and the lack of communication between people in modern society. What other themes are important in Eliot's works? For sure, the fear of living. Fear of living in an alienated modern society, and then the loss of identity. So if we put together all these things, what Eliot is actually describing is an empty society, the emptiness of modern society, a society in which people do not communicate, in which people have no real values, focus on futile things, and are alienated. And this is more or less a summary of the most important concepts, the most important themes, the most important techniques used by T.S. Eliot in his poetry. But I have to say, the only way of really understanding what I have just been speaking about to you is reading his poems. So if you want to, look for one of the sections in The Wasteland. As you know, his masterpiece, The Wasteland, was published in 1922, and it is divided into 5 sections. Look at the section that you prefer, The Burial of the Dead, if you prefer, or The Fire Sermon, and read his poems and try to look for the concepts that he is expressing. To conclude, I wanted to ask you if you know what waste means. Waste is a word which is used in many contexts. If we speak about waste separation, we are talking about the rubbish. For instance, throwing away our paper, our plastic, and our biological waste separately is called waste separation. What we throw away, what goes in the rubbish, is what us human beings waste. A waste of time is, on the other hand, not investing your time, is a lack of investment of your time. You waste your time, for instance, according to me, when you sit down doing nothing and getting upset about something. It's good to let your emotions be free to exist, but at the same time, just sitting down doing nothing, according to me, is a bit of a waste of time. So if you want to avoid wasting your time, try reading one of T.S. Eliot's works, and then if we want to discuss it, we can talk about it together during one of our next lessons. I hope you enjoyed this description of Eliot's work or Eliot's techniques, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.